Dr. Samuel Richardson's scalpel froze mid-incision, his 35 years of surgical experience unable to prepare him for what lay beneath Dorothy McAllister's scalp. The baseball-sized mass that had tormented the 73-year-old woman for 5 agonizing years wasn't what anyone expected. It wasn't cancer. The surgical nurse gasped and stepped backward, her metal tray clattering to the sterile floor as instruments scattered like fallen leaves. The anesthesiologist's steady monitoring beeps seemed to crescendo into an urgent symphony of disbelief. Even the seasoned OR technician, who had witnessed countless procedures, pressed his hand against the observation window and whispered a prayer. Dorothy's son Michael had begged her for months to seek treatment, watching helplessly as his proud, independent mother withered away in their small Ohio town. The woman who had spent 4 decades healing others as Mercy General's head nurse now lay vulnerable, her secret finally exposed under the harsh surgical lights. "Dear God," Richardson breathed, his voice barely audible through the surgical mask. "In all my years..." What had been growing inside Dorothy's head, and why had she been so terrified to let anyone discover it? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Dorothy "Dottie" McAllister stood at her kitchen window in Millbrook, Ohio, watching the sunrise paint her late husband's rose garden in shades of gold and amber. At 73, she still maintained the same morning ritual she'd cherished for 47 years of marriage. Coffee black as midnight, toast with Harold's homemade strawberry preserves, and quiet contemplation of the day ahead. The Victorian house on Elm Street creaked its familiar greeting around her, every board and beam holding decades of memories within its weathered walls. "Morning, Harold," she whispered to the empty chair across from her, adjusting the silk scarf that had become her constant companion these past months. The gentle fabric concealed what she refused to acknowledge, a growing lump that had transformed from a small bump into something she could no longer ignore. As Mercy General's former head nurse, Dorothy knew better than most what delayed medical attention could mean. Yet here she sat, a woman who had spent 4 decades urging patients toward early detection, practicing the very denial she had counseled against. The phone's shrill ring interrupted her thoughts. Michael's name appeared on the caller ID, and Dorothy's heart performed its familiar dance of joy and anxiety. Her son called religiously every other Sunday from his Chicago apartment, their conversations following a predictable pattern of weather, work, and gentle inquiries about her well-being that she deflected with practiced ease. "Morning, sugar," she answered, forcing brightness into her voice while unconsciously touching the scarf's edge. "Hey, Mom. How are you feeling?" Michael's voice carried that particular tone of a man juggling too many responsibilities, and Dorothy caught the underlying tension immediately. "Right as rain, honey. Just finished my coffee and was about to tend Harold's roses." "You sound tired." She settled into her chair, noting how the morning light revealed the kitchen's growing shabbiness. Peeling wallpaper she couldn't afford to replace, a leaky faucet that required a coffee can positioned just so. Michael's pause stretched too long. "Mom, I need to talk to you about something. I've been laid off." Dorothy's coffee cup trembled against the saucer. Her son, her reliable, steady Michael, who had always been the family's rock, was struggling. The silence hung between them like a bridge neither wanted to cross, heavy with implications and unspoken fears. "Oh, sweetheart," she managed, her mind already calculating her meager finances. Social Security and her small nursing pension totaled $847 monthly after expenses. Harold's life insurance had covered the mortgage years ago, but the house demanded constant repairs she couldn't afford. "How can I help?" Even as the words left her lips, Dorothy's hand instinctively moved to her scarf. The lump beneath had grown noticeably larger, occasionally weeping a clear fluid that stained her pillowcases. Medical attention would cost money she didn't have, money her son now needed. The choice seemed cruelly simple, her health or her child's welfare. "I don't want you to worry about me, Mom. I'll figure something out." But Dorothy was already worrying, already choosing, already postponing what she knew deep down could no longer wait. 4 months before that fateful surgery, Dorothy's carefully constructed world of denial began to crumble like autumn leaves beneath an unforgiving wind. The lump had grown from golf ball to tennis ball size, its presence impossible to ignore as it pressed against her skull with increasing insistence. She had become a master of camouflage, rotating through an arsenal of scarves, hats, and strategic positioning that would make a magician proud. The unseasonably warm October morning found Dorothy in Harold's rose garden, deadheading the last blooms of the season while wearing a wide-brimmed sun hat that cast merciful shadows across her face. The familiar ritual of tending his prized American beauties usually brought peace. But today her movements felt clumsy, distracted. The lump throbbed with each bend and stretch, a constant reminder of the secret she carried. "Dorothy, honey, you've been out there since dawn," came the gentle voice of Mrs. Chen from the neighboring yard. At 78, Lily Chen moved with the quiet grace of someone who had weathered life's storms and emerged stronger. She had immigrated from Taiwan 40 years ago with her late husband, and her accented English carried the wisdom of two cultures. "Just enjoying the morning air," Dorothy called back, instinctively adjusting her hat. "These roses won't tend themselves." Mrs. Chen approached the shared fence, her keen eyes studying Dorothy's posture. "You've been wearing many hats lately, even indoors when I see you through the window." Dorothy's hands stilled on the rose stems. Her neighbor's observation hit too close to home, exposing the elaborate charade she thought she had perfected. "A woman my age needs to protect her skin from the sun. My grandmother used to say that when we hide from the world, sometimes we hide from ourselves too, Mrs." Chen's words carried no judgment, only the gentle concern of someone who had witnessed Dorothy's gradual withdrawal over the past months. Before Dorothy could respond, the rumble of Tommy Rodriguez's ancient pickup truck announced his arrival. At 17, Tommy had been mowing her lawn for 2 years, ever since Harold's death made the task impossible for Dorothy to manage alone. He bounded from the truck with the endless energy of youth, his genuine smile lighting up the morning. "Morning, Mrs. McAllister. Ready to get this lawn looking sharp?" Tommy's enthusiasm was infectious, but today his cheerful greeting faltered as he noticed Dorothy's appearance. "Hey, are you feeling okay? You look a little pale." Dorothy forced a smile, her hand unconsciously moving to steady the hat that suddenly felt heavy as lead. "Just tired, sweet boy. You go ahead and start on the backyard." But Tommy's youthful directness wouldn't be deflected so easily. "That bump under your hat, it looks bigger than last week. My abuela always says you got to take care of stuff before it takes care of you." The innocent observation hit Dorothy like a physical blow. If a teenager could notice the lump's growth despite her careful concealment, how long before others saw through her disguise? How long before Michael noticed during his upcoming visit? That afternoon, Dorothy sat at Harold's old desk in the study, staring at the stack of medical bills that had accumulated over the years. Each envelope represented a choice between her health and her financial stability, between self-care and the independence she prized above all else. Her nursing pension provided just enough to cover basic expenses, leaving no room for the luxury of medical attention. The landline's ring startled her from her brooding. Sarah Beth's name on the caller ID brought a mixture of joy and apprehension. Her daughter called even less frequently than Michael, caught up in her own life with her husband and 2 children in California. "Hi, Mom. Michael told me about his job situation. I'm so sorry I can't help financially right now. David's hours got cut, and the kids need so much." Sarah Beth's voice carried the exhaustion of a woman stretched too thin. "Don't you worry about us, sweetheart. We'll manage just fine." Dorothy's voice remained steady, even as her world seemed to tilt off its axis. Both her children were struggling, and here she sat with a medical condition that could bankrupt what little security remained. After hanging up, Dorothy walked to the bathroom mirror and slowly removed her hat. The lump had developed an angry reddish hue around its base, and she could see tiny blood vessels mapping its surface like a road map to somewhere she didn't want to go. Her nursing training screamed warnings she couldn't afford to heed. That evening, as purple shadows claimed the garden, Dorothy made a decision that would haunt her for months to come. She would wait until after the holidays to seek medical attention. Michael needed financial help more than she needed expensive tests. Sarah Beth had enough burdens without adding her mother's health concerns. The lump had waited this long. Surely it could wait a little longer. She had no way of knowing that this decision would nearly cost her everything, or that the secret growing beneath her scalp would soon reveal a truth more shocking than she could ever imagine. 3 months before the surgery that would change everything, Dorothy's carefully orchestrated world of secrecy collapsed in a single wind-swept moment that left her exposed and vulnerable. Michael had arrived for her 73rd birthday weekend, his Chicago sophistication seeming out of place in the small-town rhythm of Millbrook. Dorothy had spent hours preparing for his visit, selecting her most elaborate hat and scarf combination and practicing casual movements that would keep the lump hidden from his sharp insurance adjuster eyes. The October afternoon was crisp and perfect, the kind of day that made Ohio's autumn famous. Dorothy had suggested they visit Harold's Rose Garden together, thinking the familiar ritual would provide comfortable distraction. Michael walked beside her, his smartphone constantly buzzing with what he claimed were potential job leads, though Dorothy noticed his increasing agitation with each call. "Mom, we need to talk about your finances," Michael said, his voice carrying the weight of a man accustomed to delivering difficult news. "I know you've been sending me money, and with my situation—" A sudden gust of wind, playful and fierce, swept across the garden like nature's own mischievous hand. Dorothy's carefully positioned wide-brimmed hat lifted from her head as if carried by invisible wings, tumbling across the lawn like a wayward butterfly. Time seemed suspended as both mother and son watched the hat's flight, neither moving to retrieve it. Michael's face transformed from mild concern to horror in the space of a heartbeat. The lump, now the size of a small apple, sat prominently on Dorothy's scalp like some grotesque crown. Its surface appeared angry and inflamed, with visible veins mapping its circumference in a disturbing pattern that spoke of rapid growth and potential danger. "Mom, what the hell is that?" The words exploded from Michael's lips with such force that Mrs. Chen looked up from her own garden, her weathered face creasing with concern. Dorothy's hands flew to her head, a gesture both protective and futile now that her secret lay exposed under the afternoon sun. "Language, Michael. It's just a little cyst. Nothing to worry about." "Nothing to worry about?" Michael's voice cracked with disbelief and rising panic. "Mom, that thing is huge. How long has it been there? Why didn't you tell me?" The confrontation that followed would echo through both their memories for months to come. Michael's shock gave way to anger, then to guilt, then to a desperate determination that frightened Dorothy more than her own condition. He paced the garden like a caged animal, his hands running through his hair in a gesture she remembered from his troubled teenage years. "We're going to the emergency room. Right now." Michael's declaration brooked no argument, but Dorothy had spent 7 decades perfecting the art of maternal authority. "We most certainly are not. Do you have any idea what an emergency room visit costs? I can't afford—" "I don't care what it costs." Michael's shout startled a flock of sparrows from Harold's prize rosebush. "Mom, you're a nurse. You know what this could be. You know what happens when people wait too long." The argument drew Mrs. Chen to the fence separating their properties, her presence both intrusive and oddly comforting. Dorothy had always appreciated her neighbor's respectful distance, but now she found herself grateful for the gentle interruption. "Forgive me for listening," Mrs. Chen said softly, her accent making the words sound like a whispered prayer. "But I think maybe it's time to stop hiding, Dorothy." The simple statement hit Dorothy with the force of revelation. She had been hiding from her children, from her neighbors, from herself. The elaborate charades with hats and scarves weren't just concealment, they were a form of self-imposed exile from the world of the living. "Mrs. Chen, with all due respect, this is a family matter," Michael said, though his tone carried none of the harshness his words implied. He was a man drowning in circumstances beyond his control, grasping for any semblance of authority. "Family," Mrs. Chen repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, I understand family. I also understand what happens when pride becomes more important than life." Dorothy found herself caught between her son's desperate concern and her neighbor's quiet wisdom. The lump throbbed as if responding to the attention, a reminder that it had grown beyond the point where denial remained possible. "The cost, Michael, the tests, the doctors, the treatments, it could be tens of thousands of dollars. Money you need right now, money I don't have." Dorothy's voice cracked with the weight of impossible choices. "I won't bankrupt what's left of this family for the sake of an old woman's vanity." Vanity? Michael's voice rose to a pitch Dorothy hadn't heard since his adolescence. "Mom, this isn't about vanity. This is about your life." Tommy Rodriguez chose that moment to arrive for his weekly lawn service, his ancient pickup truck announcing his presence with a series of backfires that sounded like gunshots. The teenager emerged from his vehicle, took one look at the scene unfolding in the garden, and immediately understood that he had stumbled into something far more serious than autumn yard work. "Maybe I should come back later," Tommy said quietly, but Mrs. Chen motioned for him to stay. "No, young man. Sometimes the truth needs witnesses." Dorothy looked around at the unlikely assembly gathered in her garden, her desperate son, her wise neighbor, and the teenager who had shown her more consistent kindness than her own children in recent months. The moment felt both intimate and exposed, private yet communal, like standing at the center of a storm while being surrounded by shelter. The lump pulsed beneath her fingertips, and Dorothy realized that her time for hiding had finally, irrevocably, come to an end. The weeks following Michael's discovery transformed Dorothy's quiet existence into a whirlwind of medical appointments, insurance battles, and family tensions that threatened to tear apart the fragile bonds she had spent decades carefully maintaining. The lump, no longer hidden beneath elaborate disguises, seemed to mock her with its relentless growth, expanding from tennis ball to softball size, with an aggressive persistence that defied her years of medical experience. Dr. Patricia Williams, Dorothy's longtime family physician, had insisted on an immediate referral to Dr. Samuel Richardson, Millbrook Regional's chief surgeon. The appointment, scheduled for a Tuesday morning in early November, filled Dorothy with a dread that settled in her stomach like cold stones. She sat in the sterile waiting room beside Michael, who had taken emergency leave from his job search to accompany her, his leg bouncing with nervous energy that reminded her of his childhood visits to the pediatrician. "Mrs. McAllister." Dr. Richardson's voice carried the weight of 35 years in medicine as he examined the mass with gentle but thorough hands. His weathered face, lined with the stories of countless patients, remained carefully neutral as his fingers mapped the lump's irregular surface. "I'm going to be frank with you. This needs to come out, and it needs to come out soon." The surgeon's office felt too small, too warm, as Dorothy absorbed the implications of his words. Michael leaned forward in his chair, his insurance adjuster's mind already calculating costs and coverage scenarios with the precision of a man accustomed to denying claims. "What are we looking at financially?" Michael asked, his voice tight with the strain of playing adult child to a woman who had always been his pillar of strength. Dr. Richardson's pause spoke volumes. "Surgery, anesthesia, hospital stay, pathology. We're looking at somewhere between $30,000 and $50,000, depending on complications." The number hung in the air like a death sentence. Dorothy felt the color drain from her face as she mentally compared the figure to her modest savings account, which held barely $3,000 after Harold's funeral expenses 5 years earlier. Michael's sharp intake of breath confirmed what she already knew. The cost was impossible. "Insurance will cover most of it," Dr. Richardson added quickly, noting their expressions. "But there are always deductibles, co-pays, and potential complications that might not be covered." That evening, Dorothy sat at Harold's old desk in the study, surrounded by insurance documents that might as well have been written in ancient Greek for all the sense they made to her. Michael paced behind her chair, reading over her shoulder and muttering about pre-existing condition clauses and coverage gaps, with the fluency of someone who spent his professional life denying similar claims. "Mom, there's something I need to tell you," Michael said finally, his voice carrying a weight that made Dorothy's stomach clench with foreboding. "I've been researching your policy, and there's a clause about conditions that existed before coverage began." Dorothy's hands stilled on the documents. "What kind of clause?" "If the insurance company can prove you knew about the condition and didn't disclose it when you enrolled, they can deny coverage entirely." Michael's words fell like hammer blows against her already fragile composure. The implications crashed over Dorothy like a tsunami of dread. She had noticed the small bump 5 years ago, long before her current insurance policy began. Her nursing background had told her it was probably benign, just another indignity of aging, but the timeline created a potential loophole that could leave her financially devastated. Meanwhile, the small town of Millbrook had begun to buzz with whispered conversations about Dorothy's condition. Mrs. Chen, despite her promise of discretion, had mentioned the situation to her Tuesday morning walking group, a collection of elderly women who treated gossip like a sacred duty. The news spread through the community like ripples on a pond, each retelling adding new layers of concern and speculation. Tommy Rodriguez became an unexpected source of support during this turbulent period. The teenager's genuine concern touched Dorothy in ways that her own children's complicated mixture of love and obligation could not. He arrived each day after school, ostensibly to help with yard work, but actually to check on her well-being with the straightforward honesty that only the young possess. "Mrs. McAllister, my abuela says you need to fight this thing like you fought for all those patients at the hospital," Tommy told her one afternoon as they sat on the porch watching the November light fade from golden to gray. "She says sometimes being brave means letting other people help you." Dorothy found herself moved by the teenager's simple wisdom, delivered with the casual confidence of someone who had never learned to doubt the fundamental goodness of people. Tommy's grandmother, Rosa Rodriguez, had cleaned offices at Mercy General for 20 years, and their paths had crossed countless times during Dorothy's nursing career. The connection felt like a bridge across generations, a reminder that her years of service had created bonds she had forgotten existed. The insurance investigation began 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, initiated by an anonymous tip that Dorothy suspected came from someone who knew her medical history. A stern-faced woman named Janet Morrison arrived at Dorothy's door with a briefcase full of questions and a mandate to determine the exact timeline of her condition's development. "Mrs. McAllister, can you tell me when you first noticed any abnormality in the area where the mass is currently located?" Morrison's voice carried the practiced neutrality of someone trained to extract confessions disguised as cooperation. Dorothy faced an impossible choice between honesty and financial survival. Her nursing ethics demanded truth, but her practical reality demanded strategic amnesia. She sat across from Morrison in her own living room, feeling like a defendant in a trial where the verdict would determine not just her financial future, but her very survival. "I first noticed something unusual about 6 months ago," Dorothy lied, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. "It was very small then, barely noticeable." Morrison's pen scratched across her notepad with the sound of judgment being rendered. "And you sought no medical attention at that time because—" "I thought it was just a sebaceous cyst, something that would resolve on its own." The partial truth felt only marginally better than the outright lie. Michael had warned her about this interview, coaching her with the same skills he used to protect his insurance company from fraudulent claims. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. He was teaching his mother to deceive the very system that employed him, using his professional expertise to protect his family rather than his employer's bottom line. The days following Morrison's visit brought a parade of unexpected visitors to Dorothy's door. Former colleagues from Mercy General arrived with casseroles and concern, their presence both comforting and overwhelming. Margaret Sullivan, who had worked alongside Dorothy in pediatrics for 15 years, brought homemade chicken soup and a check for $500. "Don't you dare refuse this," Margaret said firmly, pressing the check into Dorothy's reluctant hands. "You helped me through my divorce, my son's addiction, and more bad days than I care to count. This is payback time." Similar scenes played out throughout the week as Dorothy's former life as a caregiver came full circle. Patients she had nursed decades earlier appeared at her door with flowers and small donations, their faces aged, but their gratitude intact. The wife of a man whose life Dorothy had helped save during a heart attack in 1987 brought a $1,000 money order, refusing to leave until Dorothy accepted it. "You gave us 30 more years together," the woman said through tears. "This is the least we can do." But perhaps the most surprising support came from Sarah Beth, who called from California with news that sent shockwaves through the family's careful financial calculations. "Mom, I've been thinking about Dad's life insurance policy," Sarah Beth said during their nightly phone call. "Didn't he have a smaller policy through the Postal Service that we never claimed?" Dorothy's mind raced back through the paperwork maze that had followed Harold's death. There had been so many policies, so many forms, so much grief clouding her judgment that she might have missed something important. "I think you're right," Dorothy whispered, hope and fear warring in her chest. "But it's been 5 years. Surely it's too late to file a claim now." "Not necessarily. I've been researching, and some policies allow for late claims if there are extenuating circumstances. It might be worth investigating." The conversation launched Michael into a frenzy of document hunting that consumed the entire weekend. The three of them worked together by phone and email, Dorothy in Ohio, Sarah Beth in California, and Michael coordinating between them, united by purpose in a way they hadn't been since Harold's funeral. By Sunday evening, they had located the policy, a modest $25,000 benefit that Harold had maintained through his postal workers' union. The paperwork had been lost in the chaos following his death, buried beneath more pressing concerns and the overwhelming grief that had consumed Dorothy's first year of widowhood. The discovery felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman, but the timeline for filing the claim would be tight, and there was no guarantee that the insurance company would accept their explanation for the 5-year delay. Still, it represented hope where none had existed before, a potential solution to the impossible equation of Dorothy's medical needs and financial limitations. As November descended into December, Dorothy found herself caught between growing medical urgency and increasing community support. The lump had developed an irregular surface that occasionally wept a clear fluid, forcing her to wear bandages that made concealment impossible. Dr. Richardson had moved her surgery date up twice, his concern evident in the shortened intervals between appointments. Yet, somehow, the mounting crisis had brought unexpected gifts. Her relationship with Michael had deepened beyond the superficial pleasantries that had characterized their interactions since Harold's death. Sarah Beth called daily now, their conversations ranging far beyond weather and grandchildren to encompass the kind of honest communication that had been missing for years. Most surprisingly, Dorothy had discovered that her years of caring for others had created a network of support she never knew existed. The community that she had served so faithfully was now serving her in return, offering everything from financial assistance to emotional support with a generosity that both humbled and sustained her. The lump continued to grow, a constant reminder that time was running out. But Dorothy no longer faced her uncertain future alone. 1 month before the surgery that would reveal secrets buried for half a century, Dorothy's world collapsed into a series of medical emergencies that transformed her quiet Victorian home into a battlefield where life and death waged their ancient war. The December morning that changed everything began like any other, with Dorothy tending to Harold's dormant rose garden despite the Ohio winter's bitter embrace, her movements careful and deliberate as she prepared the beds for spring's eventual return. The lump had grown beyond all reasonable proportions, now the size of a small grapefruit that distorted the shape of her skull and made sleeping nearly impossible. Dr. Richardson had scheduled the surgery for the following week, but Dorothy's body had different plans. As she knelt beside Harold's prized American Beauty roses, wrapping their canes in protective burlap, a wave of dizziness struck her with the force of a physical blow. Mrs. Chen found her 20 minutes later, collapsed among the rose bushes like a fallen scarecrow, her face pale as winter sky and her breathing shallow and labored. The elderly woman's cries for help brought Tommy Rodriguez running from 3 houses away, his teenage legs carrying him across the frozen ground with desperate speed. "Call 911!" Mrs. Chen shouted as Tommy dropped to his knees beside Dorothy's motionless form. "And call her son! The number is on the refrigerator!" The ambulance ride to Millbrook Regional became a blur of sirens and urgent voices, with Dorothy drifting in and out of consciousness while paramedics worked to stabilize her vital signs. Michael arrived at the hospital before the ambulance, having broken every speed limit between Chicago and Ohio after Tommy's frantic phone call reached him at his temporary job interview. Dr. Richardson met them in the emergency department, his usually calm demeanor cracked with genuine concern. The lump had developed signs of serious infection, its surface angry red and weeping a foul-smelling discharge that spoke of dangerous complications spreading beneath Dorothy's scalp. "We can't wait any longer," Dr. Richardson told Michael as they stood outside Dorothy's room in the ICU. "The infection is moving toward her brain. We need to operate within 48 hours, or we could lose her entirely." The words hit Michael like physical blows, each syllable a reminder of how close he had come to losing his mother while wrestling with insurance paperwork and financial concerns. Sarah Beth's flight from California was already booked, her own family crisis postponed in favor of the emergency that had suddenly made all other priorities seem trivial. But the medical crisis was only the beginning of Dorothy's ordeal. That evening, as she lay sedated in the hospital bed with machines monitoring her every breath, Janet Morrison from the insurance company arrived with news that sent Michael into a rage that surprised even him. "Mr. McAllister, I'm afraid we've discovered some discrepancies in your mother's statements regarding when she first noticed her condition," Morrison said with the cold efficiency of someone delivering a death sentence. "Our investigation has uncovered evidence that she was aware of the mass for significantly longer than she initially claimed." Michael's hands clenched into fists as he processed the implications. What kind of evidence? Morrison produced a folder thick with documents that represented months of investigative work. Pharmacy records showing she purchased bandages and topical antibiotics starting 3 years ago. Statements from neighbors indicating she began wearing hats and scarves around the same time. Most damning, a medical supply order from 2 years ago for specialized dressings typically used for weeping lesions. The evidence painted a picture of a woman who had been managing her condition far longer than she had admitted, a patient who had been treating symptoms while avoiding the underlying cause. Morrison's investigation had been thorough, professional, and utterly devastating to Dorothy's insurance coverage. Based on these findings, we're denying coverage for any treatment related to this condition, Morrison continued. Your mother knowingly concealed a pre-existing condition when she applied for coverage. That constitutes insurance fraud. Michael felt the blood drain from his face as the full weight of the situation crashed over him. Without insurance coverage, Dorothy's surgery would cost somewhere between $50,000 and $75,000, a sum that would bankrupt their family and potentially force the sale of the house that had been Dorothy's anchor for nearly 5 decades. The confrontation that followed would echo through the hospital corridors for years to come. Michael's professional knowledge of insurance practices battled against his desperate love for his mother, creating a conflict that tore at his very soul. He knew Morrison was right according to the letter of the law, but he also knew that his mother's deception had been born of financial necessity rather than criminal intent. She lied because she couldn't afford the truth. Michael's voice cracked with emotion as he faced Morrison in the hospital corridor. What kind of system forces a 73-year-old woman to choose between financial ruin and medical care? Morrison's response was delivered with the practiced neutrality of someone who had denied countless claims over her career. Mr. McAllister, I understand your frustration, but insurance contracts are legal documents with specific requirements. Your mother failed to meet those requirements. Sarah Beth arrived at the hospital that night to find her brother pacing the waiting room like a caged animal, his usually neat appearance disheveled by hours of stress and sleepless worry. The reunion between siblings, their first face-to-face meeting in over 2 years, took place in the fluorescent-lit purgatory of a hospital corridor, while their mother fought for her life just rooms away. "How bad is it?" Sarah Beth asked, though Michael's expression had already answered her question. "Worse than we thought. The insurance company is denying coverage, and the surgery has to happen within 24 hours now. The infection is spreading." Michael's voice carried the weight of impossible choices and diminishing options. The family crisis meeting that followed brought together 3 generations of McAllisters in Dorothy's hospital room, where she drifted in and out of consciousness while her children and community supporters debated her future. Mrs. Chen had arrived with Tommy and his grandmother, Rosa Rodriguez, creating an unlikely coalition of concerned neighbors who refused to be relegated to the waiting room. Dr. Richardson's midnight consultation painted a stark picture of Dorothy's deteriorating condition. The infection had begun to affect her cognitive function, causing episodes of delirium where she confused past and present, calling for Harold and asking about patients she had treated decades earlier. "We can perform the surgery without insurance approval, Dr. Richardson explained to the assembled group. "But you need to understand the financial implications. Without coverage, this could easily exceed $100,000 if complications arise." The discussion that followed would have challenged the wisdom of Solomon. Michael's practical mind calculated bankruptcy scenarios, while Sarah Beth wrestled with guilt over her geographic distance and financial limitations. Mrs. Chen offered quiet wisdom about dignity and quality of life, while Tommy's grandmother shared stories of medical decisions made under similar circumstances in her own family. But the most surprising voice in the debate came from an unexpected source. Pastor Williams from Dorothy's church arrived at 2 in the morning with news that transformed the entire dynamic of their desperate situation. "The congregation has been meeting all evening," Pastor Williams announced to the exhausted group. "We've organized an emergency fundraiser. Between the church, the hospital staff, and your mother's former patients, we've raised $67,000 in less than 12 hours." The silence that followed his announcement was deafening. Michael felt tears streaming down his face as the magnitude of the community's response overwhelmed his carefully maintained composure. Sarah Beth's sobs echoed through the room as she realized that her mother's years of service had created a safety net none of them had known existed. But even with the community's extraordinary generosity, financial challenges remained. Dr. Richardson estimated that surgery complications could easily push costs beyond what had been raised, leaving the family vulnerable to additional debt that could force Dorothy from her beloved home. It was Mrs. Chen who provided the final piece of the puzzle, her quiet announcement cutting through the family's financial calculations like a sword through silk. "I will cover any additional costs," the elderly woman said simply. "Dorothy helped my husband when he was dying. She came to our house every day after her shift at the hospital, bringing medicine and comfort when no one else would help a Chinese family in this town. This is my chance to repay that kindness." The revelation that Mrs. Chen possessed the financial resources to guarantee Dorothy's care came as a shock to everyone present. The modest neighbor, whom they had all assumed lived on Social Security, revealed herself to be a woman of significant means, her late husband's engineering patents having provided far more security than her simple lifestyle suggested. As dawn broke over Millbrook Regional Hospital, Dorothy's surgery was scheduled for 10 o'clock that morning. The insurance battle had been lost, but the war for her life had been won through the combined efforts of a community that refused to let one of their own face crisis alone. Dr. Richardson's final preoperative meeting with the family carried an ominous tone that would prove prophetic in the hours to come. "I need you to understand that what we find in surgery may be different from what we expect," he warned. "The size and location of this mass suggest possibilities that frankly puzzle me. I've consulted with colleagues across the country, and none of us have seen anything quite like this." As Dorothy was wheeled into surgery, surrounded by family and friends who had rallied to her cause, none of them could have imagined the shocking discovery that would soon change everything they thought they knew about her condition. The surgery that began with hope descended into nightmare within the first hour, as Dr. Richardson's scalpel revealed horrors that would haunt the operating room for years to come. What should have been a routine mass removal transformed into a medical emergency that tested every ounce of the surgeon's 35 years of experience and left him questioning everything he thought he knew about human anatomy. Dr. Richardson's first incision released a torrent of putrid fluid that filled the operating room with a stench so overwhelming that 2 surgical nurses had to excuse themselves to avoid vomiting. The mass, which had appeared solid on imaging studies, proved to be a complex cavity filled with infected material that had been festering beneath Dorothy's scalp for years. "Dear God," Richardson whispered through his surgical mask as he began to explore the cavity's depths. His gloved hands trembled slightly as they encountered not the smooth walls of a benign cyst, but a labyrinthine network of infected tissue that seemed to spiral deeper into Dorothy's skull than should have been anatomically possible. The anesthesiologist's voice cut through the surgical suite's tense atmosphere with increasing urgency. "Doctor, her blood pressure is dropping, heart rate increasing to 140. Dorothy's body was going into shock as the surgical trauma combined with the massive infection that had been brewing silently beneath her scalp. The monitors surrounding her unconscious form painted a picture of a woman fighting for her life against an enemy that had been growing stronger with each day of delay. But the true horror was yet to come. As Dr. Richardson carefully debrided the infected tissue, his surgical instruments encountered something that made him freeze mid-motion. Embedded deep within the mass, covered in decades of scar tissue and infection, was a metallic object that gleamed dully under the surgical lights. "What is that?" whispered Dr. Sarah Martinez, the surgical resident who would later describe this moment as the defining experience of her medical career. Richardson's forceps carefully extracted a piece of shrapnel roughly the size of a quarter, its jagged edges telling the story of explosive trauma that had occurred decades earlier. The metal fragment was deeply embedded in Dorothy's skull, surrounded by the body's futile attempts to isolate and expel the foreign object over the course of 50 years. "This is shrapnel," Richardson announced to the stunned surgical team, his voice barely audible above the constant beeping of Dorothy's monitors. "Military grade, probably from the Vietnam era, judging by the composition and oxidation patterns." The revelation sent shockwaves through the operating room as the surgical team struggled to process the implications. Dorothy had never served in the military, had never mentioned any traumatic injuries, and had certainly never disclosed the presence of foreign objects in her body during decades of medical history-taking. Dr. Martinez leaned closer to examine the fragment, her young eyes sharp with curiosity and horror. "Doctor, there's something else. Look at the tissue around the shrapnel." Richardson's examination revealed the most disturbing aspect of Dorothy's condition. The shrapnel had created a slow-motion catastrophe over the decades, causing chronic inflammation that had gradually weakened the surrounding bone and tissue. The mass they had been treating as a simple growth was actually the result of Dorothy's immune system fighting a 50-year war against an invader it could never fully defeat. "Her body has been trying to push this out for decades," Richardson explained to his team, his voice heavy with the weight of understanding. "The infection, the growth, everything we've seen is the result of chronic foreign body reaction. This woman has been living with a piece of battlefield embedded in her skull for half a century." But the surgical nightmare was far from over. As Richardson attempted to remove the remaining infected tissue around the shrapnel site, Dorothy's vital signs took a dramatic turn for the worse. Her blood pressure plummeted to dangerous levels while her heart rate climbed beyond 160 beats per minute, painting a picture of a body pushed beyond its limits. "She's crashing," the anesthesiologist announced with professional calm that barely masked his growing panic. "Blood pressure 60/40 and falling. We're losing her." The next 20 minutes became a desperate battle for Dorothy's life as the surgical team fought to control bleeding from tissue that had been weakened by decades of chronic inflammation. Every attempt to remove infected material revealed new areas of compromise, creating a cascade of complications that threatened to overwhelm their ability to respond. In the waiting room, Michael and Sarah Beth sat in agonizing silence, their earlier relief at the community's financial support now replaced by a growing dread that settled in their stomachs like lead weights. The surgery, which had been scheduled to last 2 hours, had already exceeded 4 hours, with no word from the operating room staff. Mrs. Chen had remained at the hospital throughout the ordeal, her quiet presence providing comfort to Dorothy's children in ways that surprised them all. Tommy had arrived after school with his grandmother, creating an unlikely support network that reflected the community bonds Dorothy had built over decades of caring for others. "Something's wrong," Sarah Beth whispered to Michael as another hour passed without communication. "This is taking too long." Michael's insurance adjuster mind was already calculating worst-case scenarios, his professional experience with medical complications providing unwelcome insight into the possibilities they faced. He had processed enough claims to know that surgical complications could transform routine procedures into life-threatening emergencies with devastating speed. Inside the operating room, Dr. Richardson faced the most difficult decision of his career. Dorothy's condition was deteriorating faster than they could address the underlying problems, and continuing the surgery risked losing her entirely. Yet stopping now would leave infected material in place that could prove equally fatal in the coming days. "Doctor, we need to make a decision," Dr. Martinez said quietly. Her eyes focused on the monitors that painted an increasingly grim picture of Dorothy's chances. "We can't keep her under much longer in this condition." Richardson's hands, steady through thousands of procedures, trembled slightly as he weighed options that all seemed to lead toward tragedy: remove more tissue and risk immediate death from surgical trauma, or leave infection in place and accept the likelihood of sepsis in the coming days. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Martinez, reviewing Dorothy's preoperative scans during a brief pause in the surgery, noticed something that everyone else had missed in their focus on the obvious mass. "Doctor, look at this," she said, pointing to a shadow on the CT scan that had been overlooked during the initial evaluation. "There's a second cavity." "The infection has created a pathway that we haven't addressed." Richardson's examination confirmed Martinez's observation. The shrapnel had created not one but two sites of chronic infection, connected by a narrow channel that had been invisible during external examination. The discovery explained why Dorothy's condition had deteriorated so rapidly and provided a new target for their surgical intervention. "If we can drain the secondary cavity and remove the connecting tissue, we might be able to save enough healthy tissue to close without leaving infection behind," Richardson explained to his team, though his voice carried little confidence in the plan's chances of success. The next hour became a race against time as Dorothy's body fought against the continued trauma of surgery while her surgical team worked to address complications that seemed to multiply with each passing minute. Her blood pressure required constant medication to maintain minimal function, while her heart struggled to pump blood through a system compromised by massive inflammation and blood loss. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Dorothy's crisis was the gradual realization of what the shrapnel represented. As Richardson carefully examined the fragment, its size and composition told the story of an explosion that had occurred decades earlier, likely during Dorothy's young adulthood, when she would have been most vulnerable to such trauma. The metal bore markings that suggested military ordnance, but Dorothy had never served in combat. The mystery of how battlefield shrapnel had become embedded in a small-town nurse's skull would prove to be the key to understanding not just her medical condition, but the deepest secrets of her marriage to Harold McAllister. As Dorothy's surgery entered its 6th hour, her family waited in growing despair while her surgical team fought against complications that seemed determined to claim the life of a woman who had spent her career saving others. The irony was not lost on anyone present that Dorothy McAllister, who had helped countless patients through their darkest medical moments, now lay fighting for her own life on the table where she had once worked to save others. The outcome remained uncertain as evening fell over Millbrook Regional Hospital, with Dorothy's fate hanging in the balance between surgical skill and the body's ability to survive trauma that had been building for 50 years. The revelation that would forever change the McAllister family's understanding of their history began with Dorothy's whispered words as she emerged from the deepest unconsciousness of her life. 7 days after the surgery that had nearly claimed her life, she opened her eyes in the ICU and spoke a single word that sent shockwaves through everyone who heard it. Harold. But it wasn't the loving murmur of a widow calling for her deceased husband. It was the sharp, urgent tone of a young nurse calling to a wounded soldier, her voice carrying the weight of memory that had been buried for over 50 years beneath layers of careful silence and deliberate forgetting. Michael and Sarah Beth had maintained a constant vigil beside their mother's bed, taking turns reading to her unconscious form and sharing memories from their childhood in hopes that familiar voices might guide her back to consciousness. When Dorothy's eyes finally opened, both children leaned forward with relief and anticipation, expecting the first words of recovery and gratitude. Instead, Dorothy's gaze fixed on something beyond their presence, her eyes wide with the terror of someone reliving trauma that had been locked away in the deepest recesses of memory. "Harold, stay with me," she whispered, her voice carrying the desperation of someone watching life slip away. "Don't you dare die on me, soldier." Dr. Richardson, who had been monitoring Dorothy's recovery with the intensity of someone whose reputation had been challenged by her case, immediately recognized the signs of traumatic memory surfacing under the influence of post-surgical medications and the shock of the shrapnel discovery. "Mrs. McAllister, you're in the hospital. You're safe, doctor," Richardson said gently, but Dorothy's eyes remained focused on a scene that existed only in her memory, a moment from 1972 that had been buried beneath decades of careful silence. "The explosion," Dorothy continued, her voice growing stronger but remaining locked in the past. "The mortar shell hit right next to us. Harold was bleeding so much blood." Her hands moved to her head, touching the bandages that covered her surgical site with the same gentle precision she had once used to treat wounded soldiers. Sarah Beth exchanged a confused glance with Michael, both children struggling to reconcile their mother's words with everything they thought they knew about their parents' early life together. Harold had been a postal worker, not a soldier. Their mother had been a small-town nurse, not someone who treated battlefield casualties. But Mrs. Chen, who had remained a constant presence during Dorothy's recovery, stepped closer to the bed with the expression of someone for whom puzzle pieces were finally falling into place. "Dorothy, honey, you were there with him, weren't you? In Vietnam?" The question unlocked a flood of memories that poured from Dorothy's lips with the force of water breaking through a dam that had held for 50 years. The story that emerged over the next hour shattered every assumption her children had made about their parents' early life and revealed a love story forged in the crucible of war. Dorothy McAllister, née Williams, had not been a small-town nurse who met her husband at a church social, as she had told her children for decades. She had been a volunteer nurse with the Red Cross, one of the brave young women who had chosen to serve in Vietnam's field hospitals when the casualties mounted beyond the military's ability to provide adequate care. Harold McAllister had not been a postal worker who avoided military service through a college deferment. He had been a Marine Corps sergeant whose third tour of duty in Vietnam had been cut short by the mortar attack that nearly claimed his life and embedded shrapnel throughout his body, including a piece that had lodged in Dorothy's scalp when she threw herself across his wounded form to protect him from secondary explosions. "I was treating wounded soldiers in a field hospital near Da Nang," Dorothy continued, her voice growing clearer as the memories surfaced. "Harold came in with shrapnel wounds all over his body. We worked on him for hours, picking out metal fragments one by one, but that last mortar round hit while I was still working on him." The explosion had thrown Dorothy across Harold's body, driving a piece of shrapnel deep into her scalp while simultaneously saving his life by shielding him from additional fragments. In the chaos that followed, with wounded soldiers requiring immediate attention and resources stretched beyond their limits, Dorothy's own injury had been treated quickly and superficially. The embedded shrapnel missed in the urgency of battlefield medicine. "We didn't know," Dorothy whispered, tears streaming down her face as she relived the moment that had shaped the rest of her life. The field medic said it was just a graze. With everything else happening, no one had time for x-rays or detailed examinations. We just bandaged it up and kept working. Harold's recovery had taken months, during which Dorothy had remained at his side as both nurse and increasingly devoted companion. Their romance had bloomed in the sterile environment of a military hospital, nurtured by shared trauma and the fierce intensity of young love tested by war. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Michael, struggling to process the complete reconstruction of his parents' history, asked the question that had been building in his mind since Dorothy's memories began flowing. "Mom, if you were both in Vietnam, why did you never tell us?" Why did you create such elaborate stories about how you met? Dorothy's answer revealed the final, heartbreaking truth about her decades of silence. When they returned to the United States in 1973, Harold had been struggling with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, while Dorothy carried her own invisible wounds from the trauma of battlefield nursing. The young couple had made a conscious decision to bury their war experiences and create new identities that would allow them to build a normal life together. "We wanted to forget," Dorothy explained, her voice heavy with the weight of decades-old decisions. "Harold had nightmares every night for the first 5 years we were home. I would wake up screaming from dreams about wounded soldiers calling for help I couldn't give. We thought if we never talked about it, if we pretended it never happened, we could leave the war behind us." The elaborate fiction they had constructed included Harold's supposed college education and postal service career, Dorothy's fabricated nursing school attendance in Ohio, and their invented meeting at a church social dance. They had lived their lie so completely that even their own children had never suspected the truth about their parents' heroic service to their country. Mrs. Chen's tears joined Dorothy's as the elderly woman recognized the profound sacrifice that her friend had made in choosing silence over recognition. "You gave up everything," Mrs. Chen whispered. "The benefits, the recognition, the help you both deserved, all to protect your family from the truth." The implications of Dorothy's revelation extended far beyond family history. As a veteran nurse who had served in combat conditions, she was entitled to comprehensive medical benefits through the Veterans Administration that could have covered her recent surgery completely. Harold's military service qualified him for burial benefits and survivor support that Dorothy had never claimed, because acknowledging them would have required admitting their carefully constructed new life was built on deliberate deception. Dr. Richardson listened to Dorothy's story with growing amazement and professional fascination. The shrapnel that had nearly killed her was a 50-year-old war wound that had been slowly working its way toward the surface of her skull, her body's natural healing processes gradually pushing the foreign object outward until it created the mass that had terrified her family. "Mrs. McAllister, this changes everything about your case," Dr. Richardson explained. "This isn't a random medical condition. This is a combat injury that has been developing complications for 5 decades. You're entitled to full VA medical coverage for any treatment related to this injury." But perhaps the most profound impact of Dorothy's revelation was on her relationship with her children. Michael and Sarah Beth found themselves grieving not just for the mother they thought they knew, but for the parents whose heroic service they had never been allowed to honor. The woman they had seen as a simple small-town nurse revealed herself to be a combat veteran whose courage under fire had saved countless lives, including that of the man who became their father. Tommy Rodriguez, who had remained at the hospital throughout Dorothy's recovery, approached her bed with the reverence of someone meeting a genuine war hero. "Mrs. McAllister, my grandfather served in Vietnam too. He always said the nurses were the bravest people over there because they never had weapons to protect themselves, just their medical training and their courage." Dorothy's response revealed the final layer of her story's complexity. "We weren't brave, sweetheart. We were just young people doing what needed to be done. Harold was brave. All those boys who kept fighting even when they were wounded and scared and so far from home, we just tried to put them back together again." As Dorothy's recovery continued over the following days, the family began the complex process of reclaiming a history that had been deliberately buried for 5 decades. Sarah Beth contacted the Veterans Administration to begin the process of establishing Dorothy's service record and claiming the benefits she had earned through her wartime service. Michael found himself dealing with a mixture of pride and anger as he processed the revelation that his mother had suffered in silence for years, partly because she had convinced herself that seeking help would require admitting truths she wasn't ready to share. The insurance battles that had nearly bankrupted their family could have been avoided entirely if Dorothy had been willing to access the veterans' benefits she had earned through her service. But perhaps the most important outcome of Dorothy's revelation was the healing it brought to wounds that had festered in the family for years. The distance between Dorothy and her children, which they had attributed to generational differences and geographic separation, was revealed to be the result of Dorothy's fear that complete honesty about her past would shatter the careful peace she and Harold had built together. As Dorothy's physical recovery progressed and her family began to understand the true scope of her sacrifice, the community of Millbrook learned that their beloved nurse was also a combat veteran whose service to her country had been hidden for half a century. The revelation added new layers of respect and admiration to the support network that had rallied to save her life, transforming Dorothy McAllister from a cherished neighbor into a genuine hometown hero. 6 months after the surgery that revealed 50 years of buried history, Dorothy McAllister stood in her kitchen once again, watching the sunrise paint Harold's rose garden in shades of gold that seemed somehow more vibrant than she remembered. The scar on her scalp had healed to a thin silver line that she wore uncovered now, a badge of honor rather than a source of shame. The woman who had spent decades hiding from her past had finally found peace in embracing the truth of who she had always been. The house on Elm Street hummed with life in ways it hadn't since Harold's death 5 years earlier. Michael had taken extended leave from his job to help with Dorothy's recovery, and their daily conversations had evolved from superficial pleasantries to the deep, honest communication that had been missing from their relationship for decades. Sarah Beth visited monthly now with her children, who delighted in hearing their grandmother's real stories about serving in Vietnam alongside the grandfather they were finally learning to truly know. The kitchen table that had once held insurance forms and medical bills now served as command central for Dorothy's new mission in life. As word of her story spread beyond Millbrook, she had been invited to speak at veterans organizations, senior centers, and medical conferences about the importance of seeking help and the hidden costs of carrying trauma in silence. The woman who had spent her career healing others had found a new calling in healing the invisible wounds that many veterans carried long after their physical injuries had mended. Mrs. Chen knocked on the back door, as she did every morning now, carrying 2 cups of tea and the day's agenda for their joint advocacy work. The elderly women had discovered that their combined voices carried weight in community health discussions that neither could have achieved alone. Dorothy's medical expertise combined with Mrs. Chen's business acumen had transformed them into formidable advocates for elderly health care access in rural communities. "Good morning, hero," Mrs. Chen said with a smile that had become ritual between them. Dorothy had initially protested the designation, but she had gradually learned to accept recognition for service that had been hidden for too long. Tommy Rodriguez arrived shortly after Mrs. Chen, his pre-med studies having taken on new intensity after witnessing Dorothy's medical crisis firsthand. At 18 now, he had been accepted to Ohio State University with a full scholarship, partly based on a compelling essay about how a neighbor's courage had inspired his career choice. He still maintained Dorothy's lawn, but now their conversations focused on medical ethics and the importance of treating each patient as a complete human being rather than simply a collection of symptoms. The most profound change in Dorothy's life had come through her reconnection with the Veterans Administration and the community of nurses who had served in Vietnam. Through VA counseling services, she had finally begun to process trauma that had been buried for 50 years, learning healthy ways to honor her service while releasing the guilt and hypervigilance that had shaped her post-war life. "I got a letter from the VA yesterday," Dorothy told Mrs. Chen as they settled into their morning routine. "They want me to participate in a study about long-term effects of embedded shrapnel in combat veterans. Apparently, my case isn't as unusual as Dr. Richardson thought. The revelation that other Vietnam veterans had experienced similar delayed complications from battlefield injuries had provided Dorothy with a community she had never known existed. Through support groups and online forums, she had connected with dozens of former combat nurses and medics who shared stories of injuries and trauma that had manifested decades after their service ended. Dr. Richardson had published Dorothy's case study in a major medical journal, leading to new protocols for treating foreign body reactions in elderly patients and improved screening procedures for identifying overlooked combat injuries. The surgeon had become something of a celebrity in veterans' medical circles, though he always credited Dorothy's courage in sharing her story as the real breakthrough that would help other patients. Perhaps the most healing aspect of Dorothy's recovery had been the restoration of Harold's true legacy. The man their children had known as a quiet postal worker was revealed to be a decorated Marine, whose service record included 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star for valor. Sarah Beth had arranged for proper military honors at Harold's gravesite, finally giving him the recognition his family had never known he deserved. The garden that Harold had tended so carefully in his later years took on new meaning as Dorothy understood it had been his way of creating beauty from soil that reminded him of the Vietnam battlefields where they had met. Each rose he had planted represented not just his love for gardening, but his determination to nurture life in defiance of the death and destruction they had both witnessed. As Dorothy prepared for another day of advocacy work and community service, she reflected on the unexpected gifts that had emerged from her medical crisis. The lump that had nearly killed her had also freed her from a lifetime of carrying secrets alone, restored her relationships with her children, and given her a new purpose that honored both her medical training and her military service. The phone rang as it did every morning now, bringing calls from veterans seeking advice, family members struggling with similar situations, and medical professionals interested in her story. Dorothy McAllister, the woman who had spent decades avoiding attention, had become a beacon of hope for others carrying invisible wounds from service to their country. Looking out at Harold's roses, now preparing for their spring awakening, Dorothy whispered her daily greeting, "Good morning, my love. Today we help someone else find their way home." Dorothy's story reminds us that the secrets we carry to protect our families often become the very barriers that prevent us from receiving the love and support we desperately need. How many of us have convinced ourselves that asking for help makes us a burden, when in reality, allowing others to care for us creates the deepest bonds of family and community? At 73, Dorothy discovered that the shame she had carried for decades about her Vietnam service was actually a source of pride that brought her family closer together than they had ever been. Her hidden war wound, which nearly killed her, became the bridge that connected her to veterans' benefits, community support, and a new purpose in life that honored both her past service and her future possibilities. Sometimes the thing we fear most about growing older, becoming dependent on others, is actually the pathway to discovering just how deeply we are loved. Dorothy's roses still bloom each spring, tended now by 3 generations who finally understand the courage it took to plant beauty in soil that held so many painful memories. The greatest tragedy isn't that we need help as we age, it's that we suffer in silence when a community of people stands ready to catch us when we fall. What secret burden are you carrying that might actually be a source of strength if shared? Have you ever discovered that asking for help led to deeper connections than you expected? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.